Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do a mini PC review. This is the new ASUS ROG NUC. Now the NUC brand has been around forever, but it's been mostly owned and associated with Intel. Well, last year ASUS took over the branding, and so this is the first gaming release that they've made under the NUC name. Now the reason why I like testing mini PCs so much is because I'm always fascinated by how much power we can get out of a small form factor. For the most part, I like to focus on the cheaper end of the spectrum because I think that's where the value really lies, but today is going to be a little bit different because this is at the very high end in terms of mini PCs. There are two ROG NUC models available, and each of them have discrete graphics card. One has an RTX 4060 and the other has a 4070. They're both mobile GPUs. And so this almost feels like a mini PC without compromises because, as you'll see, the performance here is pretty crazy. But like with everything, this performance comes at a cost, and so you really need to know what you're getting into before you pick one of these up. And so that's what we'll cover here today. We'll look at the hardware and the specs, but then also, of course, the performance and that price point. I like to think of it as a peek into the good life, and what it would be like if you wanted to buy a mini PC and money wasn't a factor. I'm super excited to get into this one and really push it to its limits, and so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's get started with the specs and the price. I always like to start with this baseline. In terms of CPU, we've got a choice between the two latest Intel Core Ultras. So we have the Ultra 7 155H running at 45 watts on the low spec model, and then the high spec model has the Ultra 9 185H running at 65 watts. And then the graphics are also split between these two models. So we have a 4060 laptop GPU in the low spec model and then a 4070 on the high spec one. And these are both the 8GB models of GPU, although the high spec one runs at a higher wattage, 115 with a 25 watt dynamic boost. You're also going to get more DDR5 RAM on the high spec model, 32 gigs instead of 16. And same thing with the storage, the low spec model will have 512 gigabytes where the high spec one will have a terabyte. Other than that, the specs are going to be the same. So we have Wi-Fi 6E with Bluetooth 5.3 as well as 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. Now, I warned you earlier, and the pricing here is expensive. So it's $1629 retail for the low spec model and then $2199 for the high end one. And so this easily makes it the most expensive mini PC I've tested on this channel, and definitely way outside my own personal price range, but I always love testing this kind of stuff to see what it would be like if I did pick one up. So let's start by unboxing it and seeing exactly what we get inside. First, a quick disclaimer, this was sent over to me from ASUS for review, but as always, all opinions are my own. They're not seeing this video ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. To start, we have a really big box, and this is pretty typical from ASUS. They really insulate their computers, which I actually appreciate. It's also super easy to take apart and non-destructive. Now inside, we have obviously the mini PC itself, and then a bunch of paperwork. It also comes with a light diffuser if you wanted to block the ASUS ROG logo. We'll talk about this in a moment. And then it also comes with a really chunky and angular stand. And this is super sturdy. It's made out of metal and then has these nice rubber pads on the bottom. And then also on the inside, there's a ton of padding for when you slide your computer in. And finally, also in the box, we have a 330 watt power supply. And it's definitely big and heavy, but considering the fact that you probably are going to be leaving a mini PC just in a stationary place, I don't find that to be a big deal. To give you an idea of the overall size of the power supply alone, it's just a little bit smaller than the ROG Ally X. So let's take a look at the mini PC itself, and first impressions, especially looking here at the bottom, is that they have really prioritized air circulation. We've got two big fans on each side, and then the rubber feet are quite thick to allow for better airflow. In fact, every single side has some sort of ventilation. Next, I want to take a look at the front, and the first thing that caught my eye is the relatively large ROG logo. Personally, I like things a little bit more clean, but this is not the worst logo I've seen. Going from right to left, we have our power button, then our headphone jack, and then two USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports. And then finally on the far left, we've got an SD card reader. Always happy to see those. Let's take a look at the I/O on the back. So we've got two more of those USB-A 3.2 ports, and then we've got two USB-A 2.0 ports, then a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port. From there, we've got a USB 4 Type-C port, then a HDMI 2.1 port, and then two DisplayPort 1.4a. And then on the far right, we've got our barrel plug for power and then a Kensington lock. Okay, looking at the top, first thing that I noticed is that on my review unit, some of the molding seemed to be showing through the plastic. And so I found this to be a little bit distracting and disappointing. You might also notice a subtle ROG logo in the center. This will be lit up when you turn it on. We'll test that later. Before that, I wanted to make note of just how heavy this thing is when you have it all together. The machine itself is over 5.5 pounds, and the power supply is also almost 2.5 too. And so really we're looking at an 8-pound setup, so that is pretty heavy for a mini PC. Now, one thing I really like about this design is how easy it is to get inside to be able to make any sort of upgrades. Above the USB-C port, there's a little flip switch, and once you move that over, you can slide out the top cover. And so this is where you can see that ROG logo, which will shine through red when the device is turned on. And this is where that little black square comes in, because if you don't want to have the logo showing through, you can swap out these two covers. And personally, even though I generally like a cleaner aesthetic, I kind of like the look of that red logo. And so for my own testing, I did decide to keep it on there. Now, if you want to get further into the ROG NUC, it's also very simple. It only requires a screwdriver to remove one screw. And once you have that loosened, you can slide this housing right out. Now inside, we have access to all of the things that we can upgrade on this system. Obviously, we can't change out the CPU and graphics card, but we can adjust the RAM and the storage. We actually have 2 RAM slots and then 3 M.2 slots for storage. I think that's a lot in terms of expandability. And the RAM here is SK Hynix, which is a well-known and reputable memory brand from Korea. And because I'm reviewing the high-spec model, I have 2 different 16GB sticks. The internal storage is also high quality, made by Samsung, and you can see here I got a terabyte. And if you'd like to expand your storage with M.2 2280 sticks, you have 2 slots right here on the right. And so I like that it's easy to expand the storage and that we have 3 total M.2 slots. Now in terms of actually using the device, you've got 2 different options. You can either just lay it flat like this. I personally did all of my testing in this position just because I felt like it would have the worst airflow and therefore we could see how bad the cooling could actually get. And personally, I like how nondescript the entire machine is when you set it down like this. It almost looks like a cable TV box or maybe an Xbox One, and I like the idea of being able to put this as like a console underneath your TV. Now, if you want to save as much desk space as possible, or maybe you want the best airflow that you can get, you can also use that vertical stand. And I think in this position, it looks a lot more like a really large cable modem. But one of the benefits of having a vertical and somewhat smaller footprint is that you might be able to hide this behind your monitor so that you have a cleaner look on your desk. And so you've got one of 2 different options, and it's up to you to decide which one you think looks best. I personally don't really like the way it looks vertically, and some of that has to do with those big rubber feet. It feels like a horizontal device that's been placed vertically. Anyway, with the overall hardware and aesthetics out of the way, let's move into testing and talk about performance. And like I mentioned, all of my benchmarks as well as PC game performance testing was done horizontally. We're going to start with the Cinebench 2024 test. Now, I use this for 2 different reasons. This is a more CPU-intensive test, so I like to see how the CPU itself performs, but then also I like to look at the temperatures on the CPU when we push it to 100%. And so let me zoom in here to give you an idea of what the baseline and results are going to look like. So here we are before I've started the test, and you can see on the left side we have all of our different core temperatures. And for the most part, it's going to hover somewhere between 50 and 55 degrees Celsius, and the power draw will be somewhere around 10 watts when idle. Now let's look at the results after the test. So in that max column, that's going to be the highest temperature that each core reached during that 10-minute test. And you can see that about half a dozen of those cores actually reached over 100 degrees Celsius. Now the TJ max on this machine is 110 degrees, which means that it did not reach the point of actually thermal throttling. However, for my part, when testing mini PCs, I get a little bit nervous anytime it goes over 90 degrees Celsius. And there's a couple takeaways here. The first is that, yeah, it stays below the threshold that ASUS has set for that TJ Max. And it also leads me to believe that ASUS knows what they're doing when it comes to tuning their devices to make sure that they don't overheat. So for my part, it does look like when you're pushing it really hard in the CPU Max, it is going a little bit hotter than I would prefer, but I wouldn't go as far as to saying that this device is overheating in any way, mostly because of the way that the TJ Max has been already set. By the way, the multi-core score here on the CPU test was 988 points. Okay, so next I ran a GPU intensive test. This is going to be 3D Mark's Time Spy. And one thing worth noting while doing this test, as well as all my PC performance tests later on, is that the machine stays surprisingly quiet. I was expecting the fan noise to be about on par with a gaming laptop, but I found it to be well below. In fact, this was about what I would expect from a mini PC. And I think that's one of the benefits of a mini PC form factor versus a laptop, which has to contend with making it as slim as possible. There were definitely times when I could hear the whooshing of the fan, but it was not an unpleasant noise. In fact, it was so quiet that I had a hard time actually recording the fan noise. So if you are concerned about having a relatively loud machine, I would say this is definitely on the quiet side. Anyway, our Time Spy score was just shy of 12,000, which was about what I was expecting for this GPU and CPU combo. In fact, these scores are almost identical to an external GPU setup that I had tested out last week. This setup right here is using a desktop RTX 3060 Ti and then a Minis Forum mini PC. And here's a quick look at those results from last week, which again are just shy of 12,000. In the end, I was pretty impressed with these specs given the fact that this is a laptop GPU that's standing toe-to-toe with a desktop GPU using Oculink. The whole external desktop GPU thing is quite clunky in its overall implementation, and I think that the ROG NUC is just a lot sleeker by comparison. I like the idea that this mini PC is small enough that you could throw it in a backpack and take it with you. Just bear in mind, like we showed earlier, this thing is 8 pounds when you combine it with the power supply. And so I'm not sure how often you'd want to throw this in a backpack, but it's definitely possible compared to an external GPU dock solution. Long story short, I'm impressed with the synthetic benchmark performance that we got with the ROG NUC, considering how small it is. But you know me, I don't put a lot of stock in benchmarks. I like to do real-world performance, so let's move on to that. Now, when approaching my mini PC testing, I tried to empathize with who would be interested in buying the ROG NUC. And I figured it would come down to two major groups of people, those who are really concerned about size constraints, and then those who don't have the time or inclination to build their own mini desktop PC. And so once I figured out the profile of the type of person I figured would be interested in this machine, I decided to game like that type of person as well. And so for my performance testing with PC games, I decided to set it to a certain standard, which was 1440p in high settings. From there, I tried to treat it like a plug-and-play console to see which games perform the best. So let's start with the easier to run games and then work our way up from there. With Grand Theft Auto, I got somewhere between 110 and 140 frames per second on average. And I think this is a very playable experience on a well-optimized game. From there, I moved on to a competitive shooter, 1440p, medium-high settings, and Counter-Strike 2. And here, on average, I saw somewhere between 150 and 170 frames per second. And so I think as long as you've got a monitor that can go that high of a refresh rate, you will probably have a really great time with this type of game. Moving on from there, I went to previous generation flagship games, so Doom Eternal, 1440p ultra settings, and an average frame rate of about 200 frames per second. Moving on to a more cinematic experience with Control, this one's always hard to play in the high end, but I found that 1440p and medium settings still got me an average frame rate of about 90 frames per second, so very, very playable. It's a similar story with Marvel Spider-Man, 1440p, high settings, and average frame rate about 100 frames per second, so this was pretty amazing and looked awesome. And then next, within this same kind of generation, I jumped into Witcher 3, 1440p, high settings, and again an average between 90 and 100 frames per second. And so all these games are running great, well above 60 frames per second, much closer to a 90 frames per second average. From there, I moved on to Destiny 2 and really tried to ratchet up the frame rate as much as I could, and 1440p medium settings got me an average between 110 and 120. And so that's a pretty amazing experience, as you can see. From there, I moved on to Horizon Zero Dawn, 1440p high settings, and an average of between 80 and 90 frames per second. Again, still really great. Let's move on to some more recent PC releases and harder to play games. Let's start with Baldur's Gate 3, 1440p high settings, and average frame rate of 80 frames per second. However, bear in mind that I'm not super far in this game, and so I know that later scenes in this game are more taxing, so I would expect it to dip a little bit more from this. Next up, I tested Cyberpunk 2077, 1440p high settings with no upscaling tricks at all. And this got a pretty stable 60 frames per second. It would dip down to like 59 here or there, but if I didn't have the frame rate showing, I would not have noticed it at all. So this is an extremely playable and very enjoyable experience here. After that, I tried out God of War, 1440p high settings again, and this one got an average between 80 and 90 frames per second. And then finally, the last PC game that I tested was Red Dead Redemption 2, 1440p high settings again, and this one was also pretty stable at around 60 frames per second. Sometimes it'd be above it, sometimes below, but still very consistent. And so as you can see, PC gaming is no sweat on this machine, and like I mentioned, it still stays relatively quiet, which is also really impressive. And I think that 1440p is a good middle ground, but you could always push it up to 4K if you'd like, bearing in mind that your frames per second are going to dip quite a bit. Regardless, I love the fact that we have this much power because it gives us flexibility. If you want to play it at a certain resolution or a certain graphical setting, you have the option to choose it. Okay, so that's it when it comes to PC gaming. Let's now move on to my bread and butter, which is going to be emulation. And in terms of emulation performance, I did push this as far as I could go, well beyond the actual limits of my monitor. In fact, I just recently bought a new fancy monitor that you can see here. This is a 27-inch 4K monitor that goes up to 144 Hz. It also happens to be made by ASUS, but it was just the best deal that I could find at Best Buy at the time. Either way, let's jump right into Generation 6 with F-Zero GX running on Nintendo GameCube. And this I'm running at an 8x upscale, which is just crazy. I think that's a 6K resolution altogether. And so this is well beyond what I would even play on this monitor, but it is still nice to see that it can do it without breaking a sweat. It is a similar story with PlayStation 2, again at an 8x upscale, and every game I tried played perfectly fine. Sticking within Generation 6, the next platform I wanted to try was the original Xbox. Now this one I only played at a 4x upscale, so it's only going to be somewhere around 1440p, but even then, it's looking pretty great. I did find a couple dips here and there with certain games, including Halo 2, but this game is notoriously hard to emulate, and so I'm not surprised that I am seeing dips. A lot of this has to do with the optimizations of the emulator itself and not necessarily the pure performance power that we're throwing at it. Either way, my assessment here is that if the game plays well with the Xbox emulator, it's going to run amazing on this machine, all the way up to a 4x resolution upscale. Now let's move up one generation to the Nintendo Wii U, and this one I just tested the hardest to play game on this system. So here I'm running Breath of the Wild at a 4K resolution upscale and a 60 frames per second cap. And here you can see it's playing absolutely no problem. Even when compiling shaders, it still stays relatively stable. And we've still got a lot of room to work with. This is only taxing the GPU by about 70 to 75%. Now, before we move into the really heavyweight stuff, I was curious to see how Nintendo 3DS would work as well. This one I'm also running at an 8x upscale, and yeah, solid 60 frames per second, and really not taking much from the CPU or GPU at all. When it comes to emulation, so far this has been a very plug-and-play experience. You can just set it to whatever resolution of your screen and you will likely be able to play it with absolutely no problem. So now let's move into the more challenging systems. We're going to start with Xbox 360. Now the options within the Xenia emulator are still pretty truncated, so the max that I could do in terms of resolution upscaling was pushing everything to 1080p. And so all these games are running at a 1080p resolution, and performance-wise, yeah, they were great. I got a couple dips here and there with both 2 Human as well as Forza Horizon, but I still found it to be a very enjoyable experience. Like with the original Xbox emulator, the main limitation here is going to be the compatibility with the emulator itself. And so as long as the game runs well with the Xenia emulator, I think you're going to have a really great time here. Now, one emulator that I would consider to be more mature and also easier to upscale is going to be RPCS3 for PlayStation 3 emulation. And again, here I just jumped to the hardest to play games and I was really surprised by the results. For example, here I'm playing God of War 3 at a 3x upscale, which is a 4K resolution. And while it doesn't maintain a stable 60 frames per second, especially when compiling new shaders, it's still a very enjoyable experience. With this game and a lot of other games on the PS3, as long as it hovers above 30 frames per second, you're not going to get any actual slowdown. The gameplay might get a little bit less smooth as it dips in the frame rate, but I still find it to be very playable. So I would say with this kind of setup, as long as the game works well with the emulator, you can probably upscale everything to at least 4K. And then finally, in terms of emulation testing, I also tested out a little bit of Nintendo Switch. We've got a couple options that we can choose from on Windows, including Ryujinx, which is still in active development. But for this test, I tried out an older version of Yuzu right before it was shut down back in March. And here I also upscaled these games to a 4K resolution, and yeah, they're playing great. Super Mario Odyssey would dip down every once in a while when compiling shaders, but for the most part, it was a very smooth 60. Even the game, which shall not be named, did really well when upscaled to 4K. It does take quite a long time for shaders to compile, upwards of an hour, but in the first few minutes I was seeing frame rates of around 50 frames per second. And again, this is at a 4K resolution upscale, so there are a lot of opportunities to play emulated Nintendo Switch games on this machine as well. Okay, that's about it when it comes to my testing. Let's start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the ASUS ROG NUC. As always, we're going to start with the good stuff, so let's talk about performance first. Because for me, this is the #1 positive point about this machine. In terms of PC gaming, you'll be able to throw any game that you want at it at 1440p, and I would say that most games will run at 4K as well. And I think that we also have so much power here that this is going to be an excellent PC gaming machine for years to come. Now, in terms of emulation, I hate to call this thing a beast, I just don't like that word, so I'm going to call it a monster instead. And it really is an amazing experience here just on Windows alone, that I can set the settings almost to the max in every single emulator and every game is going to play. And so in terms of being able to emulate high-end systems, this is kind of a dream machine. I was also impressed by the fact that throughout all of this performance testing, the machine stayed relatively quiet. I'm also a fan of the somewhat nondescript design. I think when laid horizontally in particular, it just looks like a console or maybe a cable box. And I think the overall size and shape of it would fit really well in an entertainment center or at least tucked away behind a desk. I also like the fact that it was easy to access and upgrade the components, including the RAM sticks as well as 3 different M.2 slots. So all in all, in terms of the positive aspects, it's really impressive what you get it with the ROG NUC, but of course it's not perfect. So let's talk about some of the things I didn't like about it. And number one has to be this price, which I'm calling a youch price. Like, this thing is expensive. The starting price is over $1,600, and the high-spec model that I tested here in this video was $2,200. And it's crazy to think that in 2024, a mini PC like this costs the same amount that I paid for my first two cars combined. Another thing I wasn't so hot on is that even though it does have a nondescript design, I don't like that there are just so many gamery angles on the machine itself. Personally, I like a more squared off and cleaner form factor, and this one just felt very 90s gamery to me. I also think that the front I/O options could be a little bit better. I would have appreciated having a USB-C port on the front as well. And I think that'd be awesome to be able to plug an external drive in when you want to transfer files really quickly. I also had some quality concerns with the front cover plastic. There was just a little bit of manufacturing defects with mine, and I assume that's going to happen for other people as well, and so I don't really like that discoloration. And then finally, when you put this all together, it almost feels like this doesn't make sense as a mini PC. In fact, if I had $2,000 burning a hole in my pocket, I don't think I would be in the market for a mini PC at all. Instead, I'd be looking for a laptop. In fact, if you just stay within the ASUS ROG world, you can find better deals on laptops compared to this mini PC. A great example is going to be the Zephyrus G14 14-inch laptop. This thing's really got it all in terms of gaming laptops. It's got a 1440p OLED display with 120Hz refresh rate. It's also got a terabyte of storage, 32 gigs of RAM, and the RTX 4070 mobile chip inside. It also has the same GPU, storage, and RAM specs as the ROG NUC. And the retail price on this is $200 cheaper than the NUC, but right now it's on sale for $300 cheaper than that. The only big drawback here compared to the ROG NUC is the total amount of system power. It's only going to cap out at 240 watts instead of 330. So you are definitely not going to be able to push this machine as hard as you can push the ROG NUC, which means that performance will suffer at the high end. However, if I had to choose between these two, I think I would get the Zephyrus G14 every single time. And that's because you can still have it function as a mini PC. You can put it in a vertical stand. It is going to take up more space than the ROG NUC, but not that much. And then of course you have all of that laptop functionality as well. You can unplug it from your desk setup, take it wherever you would like, type on the inbuilt keyboard, use that beautiful OLED display. There are a lot of reasons why a laptop at this price point just makes a lot more sense than the ROG NUC. So in the end, I'm not trying to sell you on not getting the ROG NUC, but I do want to caution you, if you have this amount of money, then I do think that your money might be spent elsewhere unless you have a very specific use case for this form factor in particular. And I always have a hard time reviewing these high-end devices because they're so impressive. It is amazing that this can play God of War 3 in 4K at your desk. And I love the fact that it doesn't take up a lot of space either. But when all is said and done, $2,000 is $2,000, and I think that if you have that amount of money to spend, a laptop is going to give you a lot more functionality. Anyway, that's about it for this video. Let me know what you think of the ROG NUC in the comments down below. This thing is amazing for what it can do, but I have a really hard time recommending it compared to other things at that price point. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.